what's up guys, it's Jonathan here. So back in March of 2021, Congress passed the American Rescue Plan, also known as the third COVID relief stimulus bill. And with this bill came some changes to child tax credit. So in this video, we'll go over the changes to the child's tax credit, 4 things you could do with the money that you get from child tax credit, and we'll also determine the possibility of this becoming a permanent change to the tax code. So if this video provides any value, consider hitting the like and subscribe button for the YouTube algorithm. By doing this, it helps with the YouTube algorithm because as more people like and subscribe to the channel, the more likely the videos will be pushed. So let's get right into it. So the first question you probably have is, what is the child tax credit? So the child tax credit is a tax benefit given to taxpayers for every qualifying dependent child. And a qualifying dependent child is any child that can be claimed as a dependent that's under the age of 17 years old. And with the child tax credit, you can get a tax credit of up to $2,000 per child per year. Technically, this tax credit is paid on a monthly basis. So for example, if you had a child that was turning 17 on August 1st, instead of you getting the whole $2,000 credit for the year, you only get a little over $1,300 a year, since this credit is paid out on a monthly basis. So the way that a tax credit works is that it deducts your tax liability dollar for dollar. So if you own $2,000 in taxes and you got a $2,000 credit, you would have zero tax liability. Whereas with a tax deduction, that amount would be taken off of your taxable income. So for example, let's say you had $50,000 of taxable income and you got a $5,000 tax deduction. Your taxable income would be $45,000, from which your tax liability is calculated. The subject of the difference between tax liability and tax credit can get very confusing at times. So if you would like me to make a video going more in depth on this subject, let me know in the comments and I'll consider making a video going more in depth on this subject. With the child tax credit, the phase out begins once you start making over $200,000 a year, or $400,000 if you're married, with a complete phase out at $240,000 single or $440,000 married. But when Congress passed the American Rescue Act back in March of 2021, there was a multitude of changes made to the child tax credit for tax year 2021. The first change was that the tax credit age limit was raised from 17 to 18 years old, which means that now all minor dependents are eligible for this tax credit. The second change to this tax credit was that credit amounts were increased from $2,000 a year to $3,000 a year for children between the ages of 6 and 18 years old, and $36,000 a year for children under the age of 5. The third big change was that the credit was made fully refundable. So in the past, you could only claim as much credit as you had tax liability. So if you had a $2,000 tax credit, but you only had $1,000 in tax liability, you can only take up to $1,000 of the tax credit and you would lose the other $1,000 that you weren't able to put against your tax liability. But now with the new changes, you can take advantage of the entire tax credit, even if it exceeds the amount of tax liability you have. And then the fourth change was that the phase out thresholds were significantly reduced for $200,000 for a single person, all the way down to $75,000. And the total phase out now is at $115,000 a year for a single person, or $190,000 for a married couple. Then the fifth change to the child's tax credit is that with previous versions of this tax credit, you'd have to wait until you filed your taxes to take advantage of this credit. But now you can get half of that credit advanced to you in monthly payments starting in July of 2021. Then the other half you'd get is when you file your taxes for tax year 2021. So all of these changes that I mentioned are only applicable for tax year 2021. All of these changes will be reverted back to the 2020 version if Congress doesn't decide to extend these changes. But we'll talk more about that later on in the video. Now, since we understand what the child tax credit is and the recent changes to it, you may be thinking to yourself, what can I do with these child tax credit advances that I'm going to get? So in my opinion, these are the 4 best things you could do with that money. So my first priority would be to pay off all high interest debt. And for me, I would consider high interest debt any debt that you're paying an interest rate over 5%. Usually in this category of debt includes credit cards, payday loans, home equity line of credits, personal loans, and much more. And given the high rates of these loans, it can be very difficult to pay these loans off to be able to get ahead. And a lot of these kind of debts have very frequent compounding time frames. Some of them compound every day, Some of them compound every week. And because of this double-edged sword of high interest rates and frequent compounding times, these kind of debts can really hinder your ability to be able to build your wealth. So after you get rid of any high interest debt, the second thing I would do is start focusing on building an emergency fund if you don't already have one. The purpose of an emergency fund is to protect yourself against any unexpected emergency expenses that you would have to make. And these expenses can range from getting a flat tire all the way to a possible job loss or a huge medical bill that you have. And by having a fully funded emergency fund, this can prevent you from having to go into debt to cover these kind of expenses. The general consensus in the personal finance world is to have at least 3 to 6 months of normal expenses covered by your emergency fund. There are some people out there that believe that this fund should cover a year's worth of your expenses. But the size of your emergency fund will ultimately be up to you, as everyone's situation is different. You might have a job that's not as secure, or you might have a situation where you're more likely to have more emergency expenses come up. In those cases, you may want to go for a bigger emergency fund, but if you're someone who has a more stable career, you may want to lean for an emergency fund that's a little bit smaller. But the advance payments on the child tax credit is a really good opportunity to build up your emergency fund if you don't already have one in place, or if you don't have one that's fully funded. So if I have a fully funded emergency fund, the next thing I would do is I would use this credit to invest in my kids' future. And you're probably thinking, isn't that the first thing you should do with this money, since it's intended to be used on your kids? And the thing about that is that your kids are affected by your personal financial health. So if you're getting crushed by high interest debt, or if you're living paycheck to paycheck, your kids are most likely going to feel that financial stress as well. And by paying off high interest debt and by having a fully funded emergency fund, you now alleviate that stress off your entire family. So there are multiple ways you can invest in your kids' future. But given the maximum amount of money that you can get from this tax credit, probably one of the best ways you can invest in your kids' future is through a 529 plan. And what a 529 college savings plan is that it's a tax advantage educational savings plan. And with this plan, you can contribute after tax money into this account. And in some cases, you could write off the contributions from your state income taxes. And in this account, you can invest the contributions and then use the money in this account to pay for educational expenses. And all of the earnings in this account will not be taxable on your federal income taxes. So almost think about it as a Roth IRA for educational expenses. And by contributing to a 529 plan now, you can really set your kids up for success in the future. So the fourth thing you could do with this money is that you can use this money to invest in your kids today. And there's many different ways you can do that, but here's a few that come to mind. You can use this money to help invest in developing your child's skills. So let's say your kid has an interest in a particular sport or activity. You can use this money to help them develop their skills by getting them coaches or practices. That way they can excel at whatever they're doing. Another way you can invest in your kids is by getting them a tutor. I know there are some schools out there that do offer tutoring services, but for some kids, a private tutor works better. And now with this child tax credit, you may be able to afford to buy your kid a couple of sessions with private tutor. Another way you can invest for your kids is through experiences. And one of the best learning experiences for a child is traveling. Traveling teaches kids many different skills and also teaches them about other cultures as well. Even though all these changes for a child tax credit is only for this year, there are many within Congress and Biden's administration that want to see this increase become permanent. Just recently, the Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, stated in an interview that she would like to see the program become permanent, stating that increase in the credit would help alleviate childhood poverty. Also, President Biden in his American Family Plan, also known as the Human Infrastructure portion of the infrastructure bill that's currently being debated in Congress, calls for extension of the revised child tax credit program through 2025. Also, many Democrats in Congress want to see the changes to the child tax credit to become permanent. But most likely to make this permanent, they're going to need support from the Republicans in Congress as well. And currently, there's almost no support on the Republican side of Congress for this bill. So right now, the infrastructure bill is being negotiated, So we'll have to see what comes out of this negotiations to see if we're going to see these changes become more permanent. So I'd like to thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button for the YouTube algorithm. It greatly helps out the channel, helps push this video out to as many people as possible. Also, if you enjoy my perspectives and the way I explain things, consider hitting the subscribe button and notification bell so you get notified anytime I post a new video. Also, I'm curious what you guys think about the child tax credit. Do you think that it should be extended, or do you think it should just be a one-year thing? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear from you guys. Also, check me out on all my social medias. I try to post there every day. And thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.